So you know my guest today, Brian Kilmeade. He's the co-host of the Fox News' morning show, Fox and Friends, hosts the daily national radio show, The Brian Kilmeade Show, and he's been writing a really interesting series of books about kind of unknown moments of heroism and excitement in American history. This new one is called The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Their Battle to Save America's Soul. Brian, thank you for coming on. It's good to see you again.
I appreciate you having me on.
So before we get into this book, the President and the Freedom Fighter, this is a series that you're doing, right? This is actually something you're really interested in, is finding these kind of hidden stories.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'd be reading them. I love the research part of it, the stuff that everyone finds boring. I find it almost, I imagine an archaeologist looking for dinosaurs. When you're able to find these quotes and see what these people wrote, and Douglas and Lincoln, they wrote so much, and to see what they thought instead of what people think they thought, I find that the whole process amazing, especially if I feel as though instead of just pursuing a hobby, I feel like there's a war in American history now. It makes me think back. If I'm going to engage you and tell you things about this country, I got to go deep in backing up my school of thought, because there's a whole bunch of people living their lives on a daily basis trying to blow up the American dream, the American ideal. And I never thought that would be the case. I thought that, man, I hope people that watch the news love history, because if so, I think they'll give George Washington's Secret Six and Thomas Jefferson, the Tripoli Pirates, a chance. I had no idea that history would be part of breaking news, that I'd be talking about why should Thomas Jefferson's statue stay up? Why should Lincoln's name stay on a school? I mean, these are the questions I get now on tour. And I go to the Hermitage with Andrew Jackson. Well, he had slaves, he's a horrible person. Yeah, true. A horrible person? Not really sure. He defined a generation. He was born, lost his parents at a young age. The guy was an orphan. And you see what he accomplished in America that had no social safety net. So you got to appreciate where we've been. And now I find myself, I go deep beyond the surface to make sure people understand exactly who these men and these women were.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because I couldn't help but notice the subtitle of this book, the President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Their Battle to Save America's Soul. This notion of saving the soul is something that our current president likes to talk about a lot, that he was fighting for America's soul. And that it's frequently involved in race. Is the fight for our soul a fight about race?
It's the original sin. I don't think there's any doubt about it. Nobody's whitewashing it, no pun intended. No one's spray washing it just to move past that. And everyone's saying, well, man, we did a lot right. We changed the world. Our founding fathers, America, democracy, freedom, free enterprise, capitalism, all we did and what we've done, the innovation we brought to this planet, we can go on and on. However, slavery was existing in every continent, and we brought it to this continent. People before us, most of people watching right now, even didn't have ancestors in America, the stats say, so there's only so much blame you could actually carry around, even though people want you to. How about zero blame? How about studying what happened, understanding how wrong it was, no one will ever rationalize it, and then see how this group of people grew from John Quincy Adams to his dad, John Adams, and Alexander Hamilton. And then you have people like William Lloyd Garrison and Gerrit Smith. And you have all these abolitionists, and John Brown famously might have been a little crazy, but I understand his intent, who understood how wrong it was even in their times. But then how do you get political clout? You need a guy like Lincoln, who thought slavery made no sense to him. But he didn't believe the races were equal. He saw the conflict, but he was never signing on to slavery. Ulysses S. Grant never was on to slavery. But then you see America continue to evolve and get better. And what was happening in every continent, America would fought a war to get rid of. So I thought, who led that war? Lincoln and Douglas. Grant, Ron Chernow just did this incredible 1,000+ page book. I didn't close that book and say, well, I could do so much better and I can get deeper. Not by a chance. In fact, I feel I lost a family member when I was done with it. That's how really made Grant. But I thought, what if I just talked about these two men and how they came together, they finally met, and what they were able to accomplish and where they came from too.
Well, let's talk about this for a little bit. Let's start with Abraham Lincoln, because the guy is practically a myth. I mean, he is such a powerful figure. He presides over what you might call the second half of American history, in the same way George Washington sort of presides over the first half of American history. In researching this book, did you find discrepancies between that myth and the person, or did you find, no, in fact, this was a mythic character?
Oh, I mean, what he overcame. If I wrote that in a biography, you'd say put that in the fiction file. I mean, abject poverty. Mom dies at 9 years old. Dad kind of beat him, licensed him out, would rent him out for other people to work on a farm. 1 year of combined formal schooling. Oh, and that's your best president ever? Not a chance. Tell me another story. I'm not publishing this. So what he overcame. He wasn't perfect, but man, he was honest. He was pure. He was moral. And I will say this. He was not thinking blacks and whites were equal. And some of the things he said will make your skin crawl. You're like, oh my goodness, how could he say that? But he was a man of his times. Right. And yet he was ahead of his time. And then he began to realize, like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's like, yeah, the whites are better than blacks, and slavery exists. And then when he sees, when you educate a child and there's no difference in their intellect and their curiosity, he, in Benjamin Franklin's life, realizes slavery's wrong. He becomes an abolitionist. In Lincoln's not really exposed to slavery. The North had 1% of the African population was in the North. They were doing their own thing. There's no Twitter. There's no satellite vision. There's no Prime. There's no satellite dish. There's no cable. You're not watching what's happening in South Carolina and Mississippi. So you hear about it, you read about it, but it's not your life. But you don't think they're equal. Well, Lincoln in real time would understand there's no difference. And I have in the special that comes out on Sunday, 10 o'clock, November 7th, you'll see on Fox News, I mean, a quote from Lincoln. He basically understands at the end that Frederick Douglass walks in to his inaugural. Not only is he invited on the podium, but he walks into the White House for the ball. Lincoln sees him, walks over to him. The world shuts down. And Douglas says, he goes, my friend Douglas, what did you think of the speech? He said, don't worry about me. He goes, doesn't matter. You got a room full of people. He goes, there's nobody's opinion I care more about. What did you think of the speech? He said, Mr. President, it was a sacred effort. Now, how does a racist say that?
Yeah.
You don't make Douglas, the first time he gets word that Douglas is there to see him, there's a huge line wrapped around the White House. Douglas waited 5 minutes before his name was called and Lincoln went to see him. But he was presiding over a country that did not have the enlightened view of race that we have, over a world that didn't. So what do you want Lincoln to do? If he rushed too much, he has no political clout. He's got no country to hold on to. And it frustrated Douglas like it frustrates us. How could you not see there's no difference between color? How could you not see if you educate a person, they're going to be, it's up to them to see what they can accomplish, that no one's born smarter than anybody else, or no race is better than anybody else, ethnic background isn't. How do they not know that? Well, go back in time, read what they were exposed to.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, I think it's so amazing that we have lost the ability to imagine people in their time, because certainly our children and children's children, they're going to look back at us and think, how could you do this? How could you do that? I mean, I frequently think abortion is going to be like that, where, they're just going to think like, what on earth were you thinking? How could you not be enlightened? But we are just like them. We are wrapped in our time. We're wrapped in a certain number of assumptions that'll disappear. And it's a failure of imagination, really, to do that.
Look at same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
In 2008, Barack Obama says, right, marriage between a man and a woman. In 2012, he feels same-sex marriage is something he's going to run on. Was he a horrible person in 2008? Is he a great person in 2012? Or is he like all of us, evolving in a situation and a life and a society in which we're born? We got to think we're getting better.
Yeah, we've got to hope, yeah. So let's talk about Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass, I read his autobiography. I think every school kid, at least when at my age, we read his autobiography. But there's now some talk that his autobiography is is sort of a little bit of a PR job. Did you find that he is different than the things that when you started out your research, did you have assumptions about Douglass that changed over time?
I was all ears and eyes. And, I've seen the videos, the documentaries, but I read David Blight's book. And anytime you think that he is making him seem too good or too great, all I ask you to do is look at his quotes. You know exactly what he thought. If you say I don't want an author's opinion, fine. read his newspaper, read the North Star. The guy wrote almost every day. So he's not blown out of proportion. He's so ahead of his time. His intellect is so great. And he's a self-made, self-taught guy that never stopped learning. My goodness, when he was learning to be a caulker on the docks, he would nail different articles to the post so we could read and work at the same time. So I don't know. I mean, my biggest question to me is, why did he need a comeback in 1950? Why did they have to write about him again to bring his historical persona back? Like, why did he dip in time? Like, he died in 1890s. Why did he need a reboot? So I don't really think that. I don't think you could say enough about him.
Do you have an answer to that? Why did he kind of fall out of favor?
No, I don't have an answer. I mean, we could look at the times. It just so happens which is crazy too, because as soon as he got black men to vote, his focus was on women. So he worked with Susan B. Anthony, other great historical female figures, to give them equality, give them the rights that he had. So he never stopped. The day he died, when he had a heart attack in his house, I was at his house there where he lived. You couldn't go inside because of the pandemic, but they said that he had plans that night to go to another rally for women's right to vote. So I have no idea why he went away. His house still stands. It's still extremely well visited. This guy that, obviously born a slave, could not be in a more negative situation, ended up knowing 6 presidents quite well and serving in the government and having the most beautiful house on the most beautiful plot overlooking Washington, D.C. So to me, he should never have dipped. But they say that if you can bet on any historical figure, they're going to go up and down through time. They say Grant is somebody that continued to grow these days. When he died, they thought he was a corrupt guy and a bad president who lost all his money. But upon further review, we wouldn't be the same country without him. But I digress.
So how does Douglas get from being a slave to being a guy that the president comes out to get a review of his speech? How does he make that transition?
Well, I mean, he was lucky in this sense that he had one master's wife in particular, slave owner's wife in particular, Sofa Old, A-U-L-D, who thought he was this cute kid, a very respectful kid, and he was working with her son. And he's like, hey, can I learn to read? Can I learn the ABCs? Can you teach me to write? And then once he got the fundamentals, he would run errands for people to learn how to read and write and get magazines and study their Bible. And he became this sponge. So the more he knew what world he was missing, as he found out the world he was missing, the more restless he became and the more determined he was to escape to freedom, which was the key. If he did not have the knowledge of what world was like and what your potential life could be and the inequities that were surrounding him and the slave life in which he lived, he probably wouldn't have tried to escape the first time and would have been successful the second time. And when he did that, when he escapes to freedom, he knows how to read, he knows how to write, he knows how to think, and he knows how to work. He's got a trade. He's a caulker. And man, does he have a work ethic. So when he gets to the North, maybe things are unequal, but he's able to keep his own money. And he starts working his way up, and he starts teaching other African Americans about the Bible. And he starts speaking and preaching in his own informal way. Then he goes to a rally, an abolitionist rally. He ends up getting the courage to go up there because someone said, seeing him speak, and he's so good, he impresses William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison's got this newspaper, and he's got this group of abolitionists who thought the Constitution was wrong and the country's got to be restarted. And he wanted Douglas and his slave background to be part of that engine. And then Douglas would write his own biography, publish and become a best-selling author, and then would go over to Europe and tour and would be treated almost like an equal back in Europe and become famous in Ireland and England and Scotland and through Germany and France. They would know this guy who 7 years prior was a slave. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the short course of what he did. But if anyone says, well, they're overhyping him, really?
So these two guys come together, both of them from poverty, both of them from very tough upbringings, and both of them are self-made men in some way. Do they like each other?
Well, they don't really know each other until they meet face to face. But Douglas is constantly prodding at Lincoln because he sees the potential and how much room he has to grow, but believes he will. And when Lincoln comes up and he starts the Douglas debates, he goes to a couple of them. And, one time his name comes up and they say, you're you're a friend of Frederick Douglas, the black man. He's like, no, I'm not a friend of Douglas. I don't think the races are equal, but I think people should be free. But I'm not demanding they're free. I'm telling you that that's where I would go. We've got to get there somehow. So that's frustrating. And Douglas writes about that. Really? We're not equal? Come on. We are equal. You've got to free us up. America can't exist like this. We're heading towards a big reckoning. And he'd be upset. But he was prodding because he saw my view, saw the potential in Lincoln, what he would eventually become. So he'd be frustrated with the pace in which he did. And he was frustrated after his first inaugural that Lincoln was too willing to cut a deal with the South, not to come back into the Union. And when he said, you can keep your slaves, you can come back, and even put an amendment in that allows you to keep them, they still said they're going to stay out. But Douglas said, how could you possibly make that offer? We can't exist like this. So that was the refrain. But when they finally met, I guess Lincoln really never talked to others about what he thought of Douglas, but he certainly knew of him.
Yeah. So, you look at the country today, and we're in a pretty confusing state. I lived overseas for about 7 years. I feel that America may be the least racist country I've ever been in. And I know we have this history, and I know slavery, as you say, nobody's trying to minimize what that is and what the history of that is. Do you feel that the left has a case to make? Is there something that people like me are missing? That when I see, for instance, a George Floyd, which set off so much trouble in the country, I think, I understand that it's different to be a black man being stopped by the police than a white man. I do understand that. But at the same time, I know police were risking their lives in dangerous neighborhoods. And you see people turning over statues. If you were turning to your black friend, what would you say to him? Would you say to him, you're selling the country short?
Number one, I would say this. Number one, I'm never going to I've not majored in black studies. I haven't studied cultures. I just know one of the best things we could do is do what you just did, travel. Compare it to other societies.
Yeah.
Also, look in the fact that 1 million Africans have come to America, and many more are online to come here. For such a racist country, why is everyone coming? Number two is if we could do things to plow the ground, to level the playing field for everyone, but not rig the game, because you never appreciate the win if you feel as though people are compensating for you because of things that happened 200 plus years ago. I'm all for it. Level the playing field, wipe out the pockets of racism as they exist, and institutions that need to be re-examined. Let's do it. But as Condoleezza Rice says, you're never going to get anywhere with race relations if you vilify one race, really for the most part, who had nothing to do with things that happened 200 plus years ago. And that's what CRT is doing. So I really believe that we're at a point now in America where if there is racism, let's get rid of it. But I believe that if you read this book, you'll understand where we were, how far we've come, how bad Reconstruction was, and why we should appreciate what we have now. And I believe that America, from my perspective, has gone the furthest of any country on the planet to eliminate racist policies, judgments, and society. But if there's things that we could do to work on, let's do it. But the minute you start vilifying and protesting and say, apologize because you're a certain skin color, I don't have anything more to add to that conversation.
I'm running out of time, but I just want to ask you, are you hopeful? I mean, this is a pretty...
Absolutely.
You are, yeah.
Absolutely. I think that America, what you see with Andrew Jackson, what you see with George Washington, what you see with our founding fathers as a whole, what you see with Lincoln and Douglas, America always gets the right person at the right time. If you look at FDR, if you look at Reagan, we always get the right person at the right time. And the next person, I think Joe Manchin's giving you an idea that when you come out and say, yeah, I'm a moderate and I've never been a liberal, I'm a Democrat, but I don't hate Republicans. I thought to myself, that might be the type of person, not Joe Manchin specifically.
Yeah.
That's the type of person that'll bring us together. Someone who just won't engage with the hatred and the vitriol and sees that, well, when inflation's overrunning the country, you probably shouldn't spend 1.7 trillion you don't have. Doesn't mean I don't like black people, or it doesn't mean that the other side is bad. It means this is a mistake.
Right.
So I don't want to destroy oil and gas because it helps my number one enemy flourish, and it jeopardizes our security. it doesn't mean you want to poison the planet. When we get people like that could see both sides, and they're out there, I think it'll be easy. It'll be very hard to hate. You'll be back to disagreeing and less hating.
Interesting. Brian Kilmeade, the author of The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Their Battle to Save America's Soul. Brian, good to talk to you again. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks. You like rotten content? No, of course not. You like great content, so subscribe right here.